Hello everyone, and welcome to part 3 of the Python crash course. Let's go ahead and jump right back to Jupyter Notebook where we left off last time. Alright, here I am at the Jupyter Notebook. Last time we left off on if, elif, and else statements. Now we're going to go and quickly cover for loops and while loops. For loops allow you to iterate through a sequence. I'm going to make an object called seq for sequence and say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's just a list of numbers. And then I can use a for loop to perform or execute some block of code for every single item in that sequence. Meaning I can do something like this. For, and that's the keyword here, for item in, and then that object, that's a sequence, seq, perform or execute some block of code. In this case, that's going to be print item. And now I've been able to print the item for each element in that sequence. Something to note here is that this temporary variable name, item, can be whatever you want it to be. So for instance, I can go ahead and replace this with something like jelly, and it will still work. So for jelly, in sequence, or in seq, print jelly, and there you have it. It's the exact same thing. So you'll probably want to choose these words or temporary variable names carefully. Here, these are numbers, so a good choice might be something like num for number, and that way when I come back to this code at some later date, I can remember what I'm actually performing or doing here. Something to keep in mind is that this block of code that executes doesn't have to be actually related to the items inside of this sequence. You can do anything you want here. So I can say print hello, and that's just going to go and say, okay, for every element in here, I'm going to perform this action, meaning I'm just going to print hello 5 times. Now let's go ahead and show you how you can use a while loop to continually perform an action until some condition has been met. I'm going to go ahead and type I is equal to 1, and then say while I is less than 5, colon, and then I'm going to perform some block of code while this condition happens to be true. And I'm going to go ahead and say print I is, colon, curly brackets, and then use dot format to pass in I there. Now don't run this quite yet, because look what's going to happen. I set I is equal to 1, and then I said, okay, while I is less than 5, go ahead and print this. If I just run this cell, I will get an infinite while loop, meaning the cell will just go forever because I will always be less than 5. If you happen to have a cell that's accidentally running forever, and you'll notice either by continually getting output or by having an asterisk here instead of a number for a very long time, what you should do is go to kernel and then click restart. In order to avoid this issue, I'm going to say I is equal to I plus 1. And now when I run this, I execute this block of code. So we start off with I is 1, which was the first value we gave it. Then we printed I is 1, and we added 1 to I. Then the while loop again checked, okay, is 2 less than 5? Well, that's true. So print I is 2, and then add 1 to it. Is 3 less than 5? Well, that's true. Print I is 3, add 1 to it. Is 4 less than 5? That's true. Print I is 4, add 1 to it. And then finally, is 5 less than 5? Well, that is not true. So it went ahead and just finished and broke out of that loop. And that's how a while loop works. It's basically going to execute some block of code while some condition happens to be true. Okay, let's go ahead and discuss a few more useful functions that are inside of Python. One really useful one is range. A lot of times, you're going to want to do a for loop, something like this, for x in seq for sequence, print x. And remember, seq was just this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A lot of times you're going to want to do something a certain amount of times. Now, one way to do that is say for x in, and then make a really long sequence. But you don't have to want to type that much, so Python has a range function. And range is going to be a generator of numerical values. So if you say range, you'll start with the number you want to start at and the number you want to end at. And if you run that, you get this range object. And then what you can do is say for x in range from 0, 5, colon, print x. and then you will see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is kind of a shorthand way to generate those values. It's a generator. If you actually want this to be a list, you would pass this into the list function, and that converts this into a list. So now I see a list of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is kind of a very quick way to actually execute something a certain number of times. So you can say then, even at just one number, range of 10, and by default, the starting number is 0. So now this goes all the way up to 10 elements, but since it starts at 0, it will end at 9. The reason being because 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, this is 10 elements. All right, that is the range function. Now let's go ahead and discuss list comprehension. List comprehension allows you to save a bunch of writing when you're trying to create a for loop to create a list. Let me go ahead and show you an example of using that for loop, and then I'll show you an example of list comprehension in action. I'm going to do this. I'm going to say x is equal to a list consisting of the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to make an empty list out, which is just a set of brackets. So it's an empty list, there's nothing in there. And then I will say for item in x, and I'm going to go ahead and make this clear by just changing item to num. So for num in x, I'm going to take my empty list out, and I'm going to append num to the power of 2. I run that cell, and then I'm going to go ahead and print out. That was that empty list. And notice what it has here. It basically has every number from x squared, 1, 4, 9, 16, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. This sort of operation is so common in Python, where you're continually appending a value to a list, that Python has something called list comprehension. And it's basically a way of, instead of having to define a list and continually append logic to a list and use a for loop with colon indentation, you can actually type all of this essentially into a set of brackets and quickly create a list. Let me go ahead and show you how to translate this for loop code into list comprehension. List comprehension is kind of a for loop, but backwards. You end up saying what you want, item, well, let's go ahead and call it num to the power of 2, for num in, and then x. Remember, x is this list. And this is essentially the same code here, except when I run it, it ends up working because it's all inside of brackets. Let me go ahead and break down these steps again. Instead of saying this out.append and this out empty list, you'll just say something like out is equal to, and then a set of brackets. And then you can translate this for loop into a list comprehension by breaking it down in the following manner. You'll grab everything before the colon, so for num in x, copy and paste that, and then you will grab whatever you actually want to append. In this case, that's num squared, and put it in here before that for loop. And this is basically list comprehension. You're saying, give me the num squared for num in x. And now you can see that output has been cleared in one line. So a list comprehension is just a way to save some typing for you. If you're confused by the syntax here or just don't like it and this is more readable for you, go ahead and just use for loops with the .append. For beginners with Python, this sort of syntax tends to be hard to read at first, but as you gradually get better and better with Python, you'll usually switch over to list comprehension just to have things in one simple line. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about functions. Functions allow you to basically not have to continually write code over and over again. You can just write it inside of a function and then call that function itself. The keyword for a function is def, or def. And def allows you to define a function. You'll say def space, the name of your function. So we'll go ahead and call this my_func. And functions should start with lowercase letters. Then you pass in the parameters you want, such as param1, colon, and then you'll go ahead and execute some sort of code. So we can say, go ahead and print param1. Okay, this is a very simple function. We just call now.